Hello, good evening, and welcome to Pacific Science Center's virtual Science in the City. My name is Zita Strickland, and I will be your moderator for tonight's program, Big Rig Truck Transformation to Zero Emission. Science in the City is made possible with the generous support from Jeff and Carmen Barr. Additional support comes from more than 1,500 individuals, companies, and foundations that donate to Pacific Science Center each year. After tonight, this Science in the City program will be viewable on PACCAR's YouTube page, along with many of our past Science in the City talks. Looks at PACCAR behind the scenes and short peeks in the many STEM careers here in the Seattle area. And I want to thank everybody who's tuning in tonight for being curious with us. If you haven't yet made a donation and would like to, you can donate at pacsci.org/support. Your support helps make sure that curiosity is available to everybody here in the Seattle community, Washington State, and even across the country. If you're a regular viewer, you might notice something a little bit different about tonight's program. I and our panelists are live right here in the Digital Learning Studios. And this is where we broadcast programming with our virtual field trips and many other digital learning programs to curious minds and learners across the country. All right, well, tonight's discussion on zero-emission trucking really will be a discussion with lots of opportunities to share your questions directly with our speakers. Now, to ensure that you are watching in real time and therefore asking your questions in real time, I want you to check the bottom left corner of your YouTube window, and you should see the word live, and it should be lit up with a red dot. If you see that, you're watching live. If not, just click the word live. You'll get caught up in real time, and then any questions that you put in the chat will be seen in real time. Now, throughout tonight's discussion, you can share questions with all of our panelists, the three that are here in the studio with me, and our fourth panelist who's remote. Hi, Tracey. You can ask questions of any of them directly in that YouTube chat box on your screen. If you don't see a chat box, it just takes a quick moment to make a YouTube account, and then you can type your questions for our guests. In fact, let's go ahead and do a little test right now. What I would love is if you can just type right into that chat box where you're watching from and how many people you're watching with. So go ahead and, for example, if I were doing this, I would type in Seattle 4, showing that there's 3 plus me, and that makes 4 of us. All right, so go ahead and put in the chat. I would love to know where you all are watching from. Since we're talking about trucking, it just makes sense that we're thinking about geography. And our viewers come from a lot of places geographically. All right, we'll see where folks are coming in from. Now remember, you can ask your question at any time. Questions might be asked in the middle or might be asked at the end. All right, let's take a look. We've got a couple people coming in from Colorado. Fantastic, already quite a distance. This is great. From Seattle, wonderful. All right, as you're going ahead and typing in your answer and response into the chat, I am just going to thank our guests who are here tonight from Kenworth Trucking and beyond for their partnership, their support in this program, and for your time in joining us tonight. All right, we're going to be tackling tonight how Kenworth is moving their big rig trucks to zero emissions, but it's going to be in several segments. I'm going to provide introductions to each speaker throughout the evening, but I'm going to start tonight with an overview of our format and what to expect. So Sean here in the middle is going to be providing some depth on the actual Kenworth trucks and the EV fuel cells. Jennifer here will be walking us through the landscape of chargers and charging infrastructure. And Tracey is going to be speaking about the connections here in our community. To get us started, though, we're going to start with Andy. And he's going to provide with us an overview of the industry. Andy Wong is the Strategic Marketing Programs Manager of Greenhouse Gas Compliance at Kenworth Truck Company, possibly the owner of the longest title that we have here in the studio tonight. Andy's previous roles in professional life has included the truck and automotive engineering project management, and he loves improving efficiencies, fuel economy, and reducing greenhouse gas. So tonight's topic is really on track with all of those interests. Andy.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. I thank you for joining us today, and I really am thankful for all the work that's gone into us being here And we are, as part of Kenworth Truck Company, we are celebrating 100 years of being in the Northwest. Started here and continues to be here. We're looking forward to the next 100 years. And we're celebrating this year, a centennial, and a lot of things going on. And part of this is giving back to the community through a panel discussion like this. And so we're thankful for Pacific Science Center. And we're talking about big rigs. We're talking about all the trucks that you see on the highway carrying a lot of load. We're talking about maybe trucks carrying other trucks, trucks possibly towing trucks. Of course, logs and the timber industry it's how Kenworth got started. Seeing that clicking. Yeah.
Taking our minute for a system to catch up.
Okay, sure.
I'm not sure if I've
Sure.
seen this many trucks in one location
Right.
in a while. So
Right.
we're going to have just let it catch up, Andy. All right.
Trucking.
You've got a lot of trucks
There
there.
you go. Lots of trucks. And trucking is, as we know from the pandemic, it hauls a lot of goods that we really needed, even to the mundane, like, toilet paper that a lot of people were waiting for. And it's part of an essential worker industry and occupation. And I am thankful for all the people that are working in it and who are doing that hard job every day. But part of it is that big trucks are powered by typically diesel engines, and diesel engines are actually generating a lot of emissions. And everybody have been working on reducing that over the last 20 years. And how does that come about? I mean, it's part of the infrastructure of our country. And this slide right here talks about the emissions overall in the US in 2019. This is something that came out of the EPA. And you could see transportation on the left, 29% of total emissions is transportation, not just big trucks, but all transportation. But overall, the emissions or greenhouse gas, 80% of that is carbon dioxide. And then you got methane, 10%, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, lots of these pollutants that we consider, well, harmful, and they are. And so what does that mean? What about our trucks, big rig trucks? What are their emissions? Well, this is informed in the way that we describe them in the regulatory realm as criteria pollutants. These are regulated, and they include carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and particulate matter, which are really small, 2.5 micron. And these are all regulated pollutants coming in the realm of commercial vehicles or these big rig trucks. So what do we do? Is the industry just about regulation and then meeting that regulation? No, it's also about things that we are hauling every day. And this is a graphic from the EPA that tells us that 70% of freight in the US are hauled by trucks, and 20 heavy-duty and medium-duty vehicles make up 25% of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, and 10%, just making up 10% of the vehicles on the road. And really, the EPA has generated a set of regulations starting way back in the 2000s. And with the latest regulation, Greenhouse Gas Phase 2 regulation, which we're in, it's cutting carbon pollution as well as improving fuel efficiency. And what that means is that by 2027, fuel consumption and carbon dioxide emissions will be lowered by about 25%, and 24% these big trucks, 16% are lighter duty trucks. 100%, $170 billion over the lifetime of vehicles in fuel consumption reduction. What does that mean? It means 1.1 billion metric tons of carbon pollution will be reduced because of the regulation that's in place and because industry has responded to that. And you can see the numbers here, 80 billion reduction of gallons of fuel being reduced, and this net benefit of 230 billion is not stopping there. Greenhouse EPA is now just released about 2 weeks ago, phase 3 regulations that is going to reduce another billion or more metric tons of carbon pollution from 2027 to 2032. So that's actually now released as a draft. And also California introduced a lot of stringent regulations starting this year and even mandating zero-emission vehicles. And why does that matter to us in Washington State? Because State of Washington also follows both EPA regulation and adopts some of the California regulation as well. So there's a lot of states that are going to start adopting California's more stringent regulation as we move into the next few years. Well, we do have collaboration between us and the regulators through, for example, Department of Energy has done super truck programs, really inviting industry manufacturers to demonstrate technology and to create technology that will increase efficiency of trucking and the vehicles themselves. So these are just some pictures of them. And also you've probably have heard that there are big infrastructure investments. For example, in 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or BIL, it's really funding $5 billion of national EV charging network, money for that, $2.5 billion for Department of Transportation grants, funding EV charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, and also $400 million to reduce truck emission at ports. So in addition to that, in 2022, there's an Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by Congress, which also funds more money for zero-emission vehicle adoption and infrastructure, another $1 billion, and then $400 million for communities in non-attainment areas, which are areas that does not meet even current standards of emissions and cleanliness. So there is this money. Of course, it's all going to take time for this to actually funnel through to building infrastructure. And all of this is part of, I think, the industry and government really working together and to make sure that we're now in this sort of transformative era in heavy-duty trucks and trucking to move from a diesel-powered world, internal combustion engine world, to a zero-emission world, a much cleaner world of trucks. So we're really on the precipice of some great change, and really excited about that. And Sean's going to talk more about the actual trucks themselves, so I'm going to hand it over.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview. You know, one of the things that struck me in listening and seeing your slides is that none of this is small. The amount of carbon that we're saving is not a small number. The dollars going into this is not a small number. Sort of ironic, given that we're also talking about big rigs tonight, which are not small vehicles.
No.
Excellent. So that is a great overview of sort of the industry and where we're in and the landscape that we're dealing with. And now let's dive into some of the specifics of Kenworth trucks. So next up we have Sean Henebry. Sean is the Powertrain Marketing Manager at Kenworth and has worked in various divisions in the trucking industry, from sales to business development roles. And you've seen the heavy-duty truck industry from many different sides of the business cycle. Most recently, you've been launching Kenworth's first battery electric trucks. And I know one of the things that you told us is that the growth of zero-emission development makes it just one of the most exciting times to be in this industry. So Sean, I would love to learn more about the Kenworth trucks in particular.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, at Kenworth, we are driving to zero emissions. That's kind of our tagline for our zero emission product, but more specifically, the trucks themselves. Our smallest truck that we have is a battery electric truck. It's class 6 and 7, so it can go up to 26,000 or 33,000 pounds. It's basically your typical box truck that you would be used to seeing hauling down the road doing kind of last mile delivery. And so we have a couple different battery pack options for that. We can go as little as 100 miles all the way up to 200 miles of range. As we upgrade to what more people think of as your classic semi-truck, we call it a Class 8 day cab tractor. If you're hauling a trailer, we call it a tractor. If you put something on the back of the frame, then we call it a truck. So the T680E is our Class 8 day cab tractor. That's got a range of 150 miles. And this is great for, again, pickup and delivery applications, or port drayage is a really good application that we're seeing this first deployed into. I wanted to kind of back up and give a comparison of the big rig trucks in comparison to the passenger automotive vehicles that we're seeing for EVs, since those have become incredibly popular over the last 5 years. I think that's a good way for people to wrap their heads around just how big these trucks are and some of the unique challenges for going zero emissions with these. So I have, for comparison, a Tesla Model 3 and a Ford Lightning on there, some very cool electric cars, and then I have our T680E. If you just look at battery size, we're talking in terms of kilowatt hours. So the Tesla Model 3 has 82 kilowatt hour battery. The Ford Lightning has a 131 kilowatt hour battery, and our big T680E has a 396 kilowatt hour battery. So we're talking 3 times the size of that Ford Lightning, 4 times the size of that Tesla Model 3. So it's a pretty massive battery, and that demands a lot of energy. If we look at range, how far that those vehicles actually get with that battery power, the Tesla and the Ford can go over 300 miles with that battery. Our truck gets about 150 miles, and a lot of that's because it's got to tow some stuff. It'll tow up to 82,000 pounds for the gross weight of the vehicle and its cargo and the trailer. Now, average daily distance, our commuter cars, they're typically going between 30 and 40 miles for a commute. A semi-truck would typically go, 600, 650 miles in a given day. Our battery electric ones are probably going to go between 150, maybe 200 miles if you have the charging infrastructure in place that you could do a quick recharge and then maybe get that extra 50 miles out of there, or you're not towing a fully loaded truck. For fast charging times, the Tesla can get up to 80% in 30 minutes. The Ford Lightning can charge in about 2 hours. Our truck can actually charge in about 3 hours when you are at its max charge rate, which is pretty impressive, but as you can imagine, that's a lot of power demand all at once. So that charging infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles isn't quite out there yet, and Jennifer's going to get into that a little bit more. For towing, probably not towing much with a Tesla, and that's probably not a big issue. So, 2,000 pounds, take it or leave it. The Ford Lightning, that 10,000 pounds towing capacity, that's great for your weekend warrior. Towing payload, that's a really big priority when it comes to trucks. That's what they're there for. So 59,500 pounds. Say our battery electric day cab tractor, it's about 7,000 pounds heavier than your diesel equivalent. We do have an allowance in the United States to run an extra 2,000 pounds for your gross vehicle weight for zero emission trucks. So we basically sacrifice 5,000 pounds in our payload for a battery electric truck versus a diesel truck. And then price, that's the other big thing. Electric cars, they aren't cheap, but some of them you can kind of get comparable with some incentives. Our truck is about 3 times the cost of what a diesel truck would normally cost. And there are incentives out there for the truck and charging infrastructure that can help kind of get that closer to what your typical cost would be. Now, another exciting technology that we have in the zero emission landscape, but something that we're not quite in production with is a hydrogen fuel cell EV. And that, again, is an electric vehicle. We're just storing some of our energy as a hydrogen gas as opposed to just all battery. So on our pilot truck that we built and deployed into the Port of LA, we had a capacity of 60 kilograms of compressed hydrogen with a fuel cell that generated 150 kilowatts and a very small battery. Since we had all that energy stored in gas, we didn't need to store it in a big battery. So it was only 12 kilowatt hours, and that really makes the truck much lighter. And that had a range of 300 miles. So you could do a real semi-truck operation in that truck, and you can refuel it in about 15 to 20 minutes. So you can be on your way again. It's much more similar to what you would expect when you're operating a diesel truck. And the towing payload, you're not sacrificing too much. It's a little heavier than a diesel truck, but not quite as heavy as the battery electric ones. Pricing, that's a big question mark. Since it was a prototype, it probably costs well over 2 times the amount of just the battery electric truck. So very expensive because it's very new technology. Let's talk about the performance of the trucks themselves. So our battery electric truck, people always ask, can it actually do the job? Do these electric motors actually work to carry that much weight? And yeah, they perform great, actually. You can maintain 28 miles per hour on a 6% grade. You can go up to 70 miles per hour. You could probably go faster than that, but when we talk about semi-trucks, we want efficiency. We don't necessarily want to be, doing burnouts in the parking lot and ruining tires. Torque, it's got enough to start on a 25% grade, and it can go a range of 150 miles. And we test all this up at our test track up at Mount Vernon. I was actually up there earlier today and got to drive some of these trucks around the track. And we do an open house actually every year during the Tulip Festival. It just happened, so if you ever get a chance, go up there and drive some trucks. It's a great place to visit. This is the powertrain layout of our T680E. Over at Kenworth, we love acronyms. So up front, we got our PCAS. It's our power controls and accessories system. And then we also have our battery packs, which we've also made an acronym, which energy storage system. So we have those on either side of the frame rail and in between. Just behind that, we have the drive inverters, and that's carrying that high voltage current back to the motors, which are actually attached to the axles themselves. Since we have the motors back on those rear axles, we eliminate that space in between the frame rails, which would traditionally be taken up by a driveline, and we can put more batteries there. So it's a really nice, neat packaging feature, and it's really efficient to have that motor directly on the axle, giving you power right to your tires. And then we also have regen braking as a feature on these trucks. So if you are going downhill, you can take your foot off of the accelerator and that motor will run in reverse and it'll help slow you down. So that kind of puts some energy back in your battery system, and it also saves some life on your brakes. Let's talk about the fuel cells powertrain performance. It's actually very similar to the T680E's performance, and we do that by design, really, because we're trying to benchmark a lot of these performance metrics on our actual diesel engines. That's our goal when we go into designing these. So again, you can start and maintain 28 miles per hour on a 6% grade, up to 70 miles per hour, plenty of torque to start on a 25% grade, but you get to go 300 miles per refuel. And this is what the layout of the fuel cell truck looks like. Up front, again, we have our power controls and accessories. Our fuel cells, we have 2 of those stacks, and that's just underneath the cab. We have an electric motor that sits just behind that, attached to a 4-speed transmission. And then we have those smaller batteries that are just above that. And above that, you can see the hydrogen storage tanks. There's 6 carbon fiber spun tanks that hold 60 kilograms of hydrogen, and that's stored at 10,000 psi or 700 bar. So it's very densely packed in there, that hydrogen gas. And then we have some cooling systems along the side of that as well. So how does a fuel cell work? I told you that a fuel cell truck is a battery electric truck, but it also is storing most of its energy as a hydrogen gas. So how do you get that hydrogen gas to actually create electricity? Well, you take some of your hydrogen, your H2 gas, and you run it through a catalyst, and that breaks off an electron, which creates an electric current. That'll go charge up your battery, which will connect to your motor and run that. But the rest of that hydrogen gas is going through a proton exchange membrane. And once it gets to the other side, it meets up with oxygen from the atmosphere. And then you get your H2O, which is water. And so that's really your only output is that water vapor, and comes right out of the tailpipe, just a little dribble of water coming out instead of, diesel exhaust. So what are some of the challenges to adoption for these trucks? Well, if we're taking a rough estimate of just the range of applications, it's probably only about 20% of routes that could work for that 200 miles or less. The weight of the batteries really reduces payload as well. I touched on that, and that can be an issue for a lot of drivers. And then something that we're starting to see in the industry as these trucks get more popular, the integration of the truck bodies themselves. So if you're thinking about a dump truck or a cement mixer, things like that, those are all things that we have to send to a specialized company, and they'll attach that and they'll integrate into our systems. Now, they're running off a different system. It's high voltage. So we want to make sure that that's done safely and properly. And when it gets to the end customer, it's going to operate still how they would expect it to operate. And then energy consumption and infrastructure readiness. You got to see how big those battery packs are compared to passenger cars. Well, 400 kilowatt hours in our T680E, that's about equivalent to household energy for 10 straight days. So it's a massive amount of energy. And so we really need to figure out and plan how we get that energy to the trucks where they need to charge. And then cost-conscious consumers. These are expensive trucks as well. So we're out there looking for as many grants and incentives to help bring down that cost. But it's just a little different than your passenger car because these are business related. So everything counts towards the end dollar of our users and customers. But that's pretty much where we're at with in terms of actual adoption of the trucks and kind of all of the things that we're trying to solve and problem solve over the next couple years as we increase adoption. So really where we see right now are areas of opportunity to increase and use these zero-emission trucks. Port drayage, that's a great route. All those routes are pretty local, and it's a lot of start and stopping, queuing in line. So that's where you're really going to see a lot of the advantages of an electric motor as opposed to idling a diesel engine and running your accessories off of that. And then urban pickup and delivery. The box truck that you see there, that K270E, that's a great solution for going around town. And the nice thing about it, it's super quiet. So if you think about delivery trucks early in the morning or maybe late at night going through the city, it's really nice when they're pretty silent and not going to wake you up. So let's just zoom out and kind of talk about where we see this going and how many trucks we see this adopting, how quickly. Well, we see that the convergence of internal combustion and zero emissions right around 2036 is where we think you could see as many zero emission trucks out on the road as you're seeing from internal combustion trucks as people purchase them. And those are really driven by staying ahead of the regulations that Andy touched on earlier. Green image and sustainability. We're seeing a lot of truck fleets that want to be leaders in the industry and have the latest, greatest equipment that is also the most efficient and environmentally conscious. But we're also seeing end customers who have environmental goals and sustainability goals kind of push upstream and say, I want my products delivered with zero-emission vehicles. Some total cost of ownership benefits, fuel savings. Charging with electricity as opposed to diesel fuel, you can see some savings there. And you can see some maintenance savings since there's 40% fewer moving pieces in an electric motor than a diesel engine. And then state and federal incentives, as those expand and are generous to help adoption, that's going to only speed that up, the more state and federal incentives that are out there to help people with the upfront cost of these vehicles.
Sorry, I don't think I heard anything after I maybe could drive one of these trucks. So that's a great pro tip. So everybody mark your calendars, next year Tulip Festival, head up north, see some of these trucks in action. And it's I mean, I see these on the highway all the time, but I was looking on your website and I saw a picture of like the inside of one of the cabs.
Oh, yeah.
And all the electronic monitoring and all of the ability to monitor what's happening throughout the truck, inside the truck, and around the truck was pretty fascinating and an aspect of trucking that I hadn't really thought of before.
Yeah.
So a chance to see these up close, great opportunity. That's a great overview of these trucks. We now have these trucks. We now need to work on how we're going to charge them. So we're going to move now to our next speaker, and that's going to be with Jennifer Davis. Jennifer Davis is the Senior EV Charger Sales Manager at PACCAR Parts. You've worked in a variety of planning and marketing solutions, and I know you're bringing these skills together to create electric charging solutions that are essential to helping the industry transition to this new environmentally responsible solution of electric motor trucking. So Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah,
excited to learn more about how we're going to get all this power into these trucks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here along with Kenworth and as well get to hear from the city of Seattle to see what we're doing in our community. So to start off with, not only do we offer trucks, but we also help customers with their charging infrastructure and as well the funding that comes along with it. So to start off with, I kind of wanted to give you an overview of the chargers themselves. So when we look at chargers, we have 3 different levels. We have level 1 and level 2 are going to be your AC chargers. These are going to be a little bit lower kilowatt output. And then you have your fast chargers, which are level 3, and those are going to be the DC fast chargers. So if you at home have any EV passenger vehicle, then you're going to be looking at charging around 7.2 kilowatts. So that's usually what your at-home charger is going to be. What we're looking at for trucking is anywhere between 50 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. So that's more in line of being able to charge a truck in 3 hours. So if you're looking at a DC charger, our 180 kilowatt offering, the Class 8 truck, that will take 3 hours to completely charge that. So it's not something that happens right away. As you can see the times on the bottom of the screen, that's going to be more for your passenger vehicle. You can see that AC is in hours and DC really gets up moving to in minutes. You'll be able to get the charge in. So then when we're looking at how long does this take to get infrastructure in, so the higher power units, they're going to take a while to get in, installed and commissioned to be able to be working. So when we look at the low power, that's going to be something around 50 kilowatts. So you're even looking at 6 months just to get those installed. Some of our 50 kilowatt units, you still need 480 volt 3-phase. So that does take utility work. That does take some construction involved. But when you're really looking at the medium and high complexity, you're looking at a year, if not a year and a half and over, depending on the project that you're looking at. So really, when you're thinking about getting an EV, you need to be thinking about infrastructure right away. Some of the main things that we talk about with customers is talk to your utility company right away. How much power can you get into your facility and how long is that going to take? Because if you're thinking about a vehicle and your vehicle is going to be at your either home or at these fleet customers or even at the dealership, the last thing you want is to have a truck and no way to charge it. So how I like to think about this is that it's a big puzzle. So we have all of these questions, right? When's the truck going to be delivered? What is my utility going to be able to provide me? Is there funding in my area for me? What's my future state look like? Am I going to have 1 EV? Am I going to have 3? Am I going to have a full fleet? What's the charge time or downtime that we like to say that's going to take to be able to charge us and keep running my routes to make sure my business is successful? What's the route mileage? All these sort of questions, and how do we put this all together to make an offering that makes sense for the customer? Really what we're trying to look at here is work with the customer to be able to understand what do you need and how can we help you and how can we educate you. A lot of times everybody wants to shoot for the stars, but at some point Either it's utilities, or it's going to be the truck delivery, or it's going to be no funding that's available in that area. But really, there are some things that we need to be realistic with. How can we make this work for companies and make sure that they're still profitable in the end? So I want to show you some real life examples. We're not just out here showing pictures, that we actually have chargers up and running. So I want to give a big shout out to PAPCAR, Kenworth, and SeaTac. They have a charger installed at their facility to be able to service their customers that have EVs. We also have Snohomish County and King County, so some local people. We have them all over the United States and even in Canada. So it's really great to be able to see these in use today. So we even have some dealerships that are starting to do public charging. Our test facilities have chargers to be able to make sure interoperability is capable with the trucks. And we're even working in our own facilities to have employee chargers. We know this is a big need, and we're here to support. So I really wanted to give PACCAR Parts a big shout out as well. We're celebrating our 50 years, not as big as 100, but it still is a start. So we want to keep moving, and we want to keep servicing the customers and the dealerships, making sure we're making offerings that make sense, help educate. We really have a long way to go, and it's something that is never ending, right? There's no full solution, there's no perfect answer, but how do we change how we look at electrical demand? How do we get that electricity? I mean, even in 2050, we're looking at a 20% demand in electricity. So we're going to need to change how we're doing things, and that's kind of where the team comes in, the city of Seattle comes in, and that's where we really need to start thinking about how do we move this forward into the world that we live in and change how trucking is viewed.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm actually in the process of looking and researching electric vehicles, and the charger aspect is a big one. And
Yes.
everybody that I've talked to, one of their first questions has been, have you thought about how you're going to charge it? And yes, but I kind of wish that I'd had this conversation with you a couple months ago. That would help my process a little
We
bit.
can talk later.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm talking chargers with you, learning how to drive a truck with you, and they'll have an ask of you before the night is done, I'm sure. All right, so that's a great conversation about these trucks, about the charging, the engines. We now need to dig a little bit into how all these efforts are fitting into the greater context of our community here in Seattle. And so our next speaker is Tracey Whitten. Tracey is the Transportation Electronification Program Manager for the City of Seattle, which is part of the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. Tracey works on strategic incentive planning, pilot project demonstrations, stakeholder engagement, and the overall city electrification strategy that is centering racial equity prioritization. Tracey, I'm so glad you are also able to join us tonight so we can focus on not just on the technology, but also on how it fits into our community.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Kenworth Trucks, and thank you for hosting Pacific Science Center. As you mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the city's been up to and how it sort of circles back to the charging, the trucks, the new technology, and how it actually ties in with the community and the folks who will be operating these vehicles. Just a moment.
Tracey, it looks like you're working on sharing a slide deck. Is that correct?
I am, and my slide deck's not showing up, not coming up in the options for me to choose. So I think I see it here. Okay, it was the last option at the very bottom of the screen. Amazing.
It's amazing how after so many years of remote work, technology still manages to throw us something.
Amazing, amazing, I know. Okay. All right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about one particular project and pilot that the city is focused on. But I'm going to start from a fairly high level view of how we are thinking about this. So as we have already discussed in the different segments, diesel emissions is a huge issue when it comes to decreasing the emissions that we are all sort of working towards in our communities. It's also a top transportation electrification and environmental justice priority for the city. The city thinks of electrification from 6 high-level North Star goals that we are calling our blueprint. First, and I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly, we really would like to see 100% of shared mobility be electric by 2030. So various departments are working towards different pilots and projects to see how can we get there. We also want to talk about how we are changing our behavior as community members, as folks operating in the world, how we take our personal trips and how we can maybe make different choices to either be in electric vehicles or be able to make choices that maybe we aren't in a vehicle at all, we're riding a bike or we're taking mass transit. We also are focused on working towards decreasing emissions so that 30% of goods delivery is zero emissions throughout the city of Seattle. And leading by example, we are working towards our own city fleet being 100% zero emissions, or at least as close as we can by 2030. And also working towards having a few neighborhood zone, not full neighborhoods, but zones, but we are calling them 1 or more green and healthy streets. Those would be zero emission areas and be just clean air that we're able to operate and walk around in. And lastly, the utility, Seattle City Light is working towards developing the infrastructure required to stay ahead of all of these really ambitious, important goals that I've just identified. So just at a high level, that's how we're thinking about electrification. And how we're doing that matters just as much. Mayor Harrell has put forth a sort of lens of how we approach our work. It's really called a One Seattle approach. And this is the One Seattle Climate Justice Agenda. Our electrification strategy really centers on ensuring that we have an equitable, clean energy economy. That whatever strategy we implement is centering a just transition away from fossil fuels, and that we are leaving behind healthy and resilient communities as we make this transition. And one of the ways that we are doing that, and what I'm going to really zero in on now, is our heavy duty vehicle electrification incentive pilot. We've talked about how, the cost of these trucks is high, it's new technology, and that folks will be, there are luckily a lot of incentives that are out there for people to be able to utilize. We also recognize that historically, whenever there's been a transition to more environmentally friendly strategies, there's been groups that have been left out of that equation and thus are more vulnerable to being left out of this transition. And so we've really taken the approach that when we are moving towards this very important transition, we are taking a racial equity approach to determine how best we can serve the community while ensuring that we are doing that just transition that I just described. So the heavy duty vehicle electrification incentive pilot is a pilot that was really brought together by our department, the Office of Sustainability and Environment, in partnership with Seattle City Light and Seattle Department of Transportation, along with a number of Seattle community-based organizations. It's also been funded by our Seattle's Green New Deal to develop an incentive pilot to enable the community that we're focused on is independent owner operators of drayage trucks that are operating within the Port of Seattle. we're focused on that community because they have typically had harder time accessing capital, are generally purchasing second-hand or third-hand used vehicles, which are averaging around, maybe $30,000 to $50,000. So there's a pretty big discrepancy when we're talking about an electric truck. And another reason why we are focusing on drayage truck drivers in that particular community is that the Port of Seattle is located within an area, for those of you who are not in Seattle, that is located along the Duwamish River in a neighborhoods that make up the Duwamish Valley. And this is a depiction of the vehicles that are operating within the Duwamish Valley. You can see here the black dots are really the heavy duty trucks that are operating. And what that means is that the air quality in that particular part of Seattle has a lot more challenges, creates a lot more health disparities because there are constant emissions being given off by the diesel fuel trucks that are operating in and out of the port. This is something that the community has asked for change, for resources enabled to clean the air. And so this is one way for us to sort of accomplish the things that are, again, centering racial equity while also moving towards transitioning electrification and cleaning the air in general. And how we've done our pilot is we worked really closely with community and with the drivers to ensure that it is completely designed with in a way that will be benefiting both. We've partnered with the African Chamber of Commerce, who is working with BIPOC drivers who are owner-operators within the Port of Seattle to ensure that we are very much hearing some of the challenges that they are currently facing and how they envision themselves being in an electric truck. We also are working with the community partner of the Duwamish River Community Coalition, and they really act as the community, ensuring that it is completely informed. This project is completely informed by how they view this being beneficial, how this will work best with their community and their streets, and really helping to define the scope so that it is, again, really anchoring that equitable lens. And lastly, we've partnered with Western Washington Clean Cities Coalition, who is an expert in creating incentive strategies and projects and rebate design to ensure that we are really looking at all of the angles and ensuring this is seamless and tight as we are preparing to launch. And I just really want to, I've talked a lot about how equity is super important to the city, why, who is involved in this. Now I want to talk about what this actually looks like with our pilot. Number one, we want to ensure that the air quality improvements from the drayage truck electrification are actually felt most in the port adjacent communities. So we really are working to ensure that folks who are engaging in this pilot, who are eventually going to be applying to perhaps get one of these electric trucks, are operating within this area so that we can ensure that we're actually making a difference. Second, our pilot, we know that these trucks, again, I mentioned that this particular community of owner-operators are typically, again, purchasing trucks at a much lower price point and will have a harder time transitioning. We want to ensure that our threshold is not going to cause any sort of financial burden to these drivers. And we also want to ensure that when they are getting into these new trucks, that there's no additional out-of-pocket expense in doing so, and that they'd be able to maintain their level of take-home pay or even increase. And then the eligibility criteria is that will define this program is, as I mentioned, is implemented and co-designed with community to ensure that it really does reflect the racial equity outcomes. As we're doing this, though, there are some things that we are learning, and I've already talked about the truck costs, so I won't go on that again. But this is the pilot that we were doing really is unique and different from the other demonstrations that have happened in California. For example, we are working with folks who have typically had harder time getting financing for trucks. So we're really trying to understand the complexities of that and ensure that we are creating different stack funding opportunities to help offset the cost of what our incentive we may not actually cover. Thirdly, we know that this is new technology. I know that I've heard from other folks in the industry and in the field that these trucks are so new, in fact, that there were maybe a little over 400 in operation either earlier this year or late last year. So that's something that we understand that we are working with technology that maybe is evolving, and that we're going to learn some things with this pilot. And then lastly, the real and perceived risk out there with this pilot is that we know of other pilots that have had similar structure of incentive and have had not as much uptake in applicants. And so we are taking lessons from California, and we're tweaking and really ensuring that we are creating a robust outreach and engagement plan with the drivers so that they're well informed of this pilot and the other resources of opportunities that are out there to help with this transition. And that is my slide.
Excellent. Tracey, thank you so much
Tracey.
for that overview. I think it's really important, all this work that we're doing, we really center it in our community and with our neighbors and the people in Seattle. So thank you very much for that context. We're going to move now into the question and answer portion of tonight's program. You all are going to be providing the questions, and you all are going to be providing some of the answers, or at least more context to some of these questions. So for everybody who's watching on YouTube, you can put a question directly into the YouTube chat, and then I will be asking them of our panelists. If you have a question for a particular person, feel free to add a name for either Andy, Sean, Jennifer, or Tracey, or don't add a name, and we'll just see who answers first. But you all have some pretty specific areas that you're speaking to, so I think that it'll be pretty clear who a question might be for. I'm actually going to start with a question from Bob, and this connects really closely into everything that you've been talking about, Tracey, but I think it's actually more of a question for Kenworth and PACCAR, which is, are you able to provide some incentives or other accessibility or avenues for financing so that these trucks can be purchased, especially access for BIPOC, immigrant, refugee, other drivers and business owners that might not have the out-of-pocket financial means to easily afford a truck that is a little more expensive than your classic internal combustion engine rig?
Yeah, we do have a financing division that offers financing on all of our products, but also very importantly, we have on-staff grant writers. So those are the people who can go out and get the money that's free to the end customer and target all of the incentives available. And there are a lot. It all depends on what state you live in and kind of where you operate, but it also looks at what kind of business you run. If you are a small fleet, or if you're operating in a historically disadvantaged community, there can be additional money for that. And so we work really hard to identify as much of that money that's out there as possible, and then we'll help apply through the process with our customers so they can secure that funding and bring it down to more of what you would see from a diesel cost. But that's something that we're pretty passionate about, trying to make sure this transition does make it allowable for our owner-operators still to purchase these trucks. That's where we started, and that's always the customer that we're looking to serve, and we don't want to abandon them in our transition to zero emissions.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, just speaking on the subject of cost in general, these are pretty expensive. I think a lot of things are more expensive when they're newer. What are some of the factors that are going to allow these costs to go down over time?
I think it really comes down to battery technology right now. That's definitely the highest priced item right now in the trucks. And so as we see that technology improve, we see more companies get out there and start producing these batteries, find more efficiencies, or maybe different chemistries that are less intensive with the metals that they use and things like that. Then you'll start to see those battery costs come down. There's a lot of money from the federal government right now going towards domestic battery manufacturing. So as that really plays out, I think we'll see the cost of the total truck come down as well.
All right. Just wasn't sure if anybody else wanted to add.
Yeah, I do want to add to that because battery is one big item, and I think part of that cost related to when we talk about separately hydrogen, fuel cell EVs. I mean, that's even the sort of the next step technology that's still more or less in development, and it has its own sort of cost structure that is also needs to be overcome. I would say over the course of more years in the future. So I think there's I guess there's two tiers of kind of types of vehicles and costs coming down that will help the overall transition.
Yeah, and I guess I'll jump into with the charger, but as the grid gets better and, we start getting the electricity out there and we start finding new ways to get electricity, that's really going to help with the cost. That's really going to help with sustainability of everything. And then also with the more charger companies that are coming out, technology, again, similar to the trucks, as that grows, it's just going to get more efficient and better and hopefully less cost to the end user so that it can be more feasible for everyone to be involved with.
Excellent. Thank you. I have more questions about the hydrogen fuel cell, but first I'm going to actually turn to Tracey. I have a question for you. So somebody from YouTube commented, thank you, fantastic information. They're curious. So regarding the heavy duty electric or the vehicle electrification incentive pilot, how do people become more aware and then hopefully more supportive of local initiatives like this?
That's a really good question. I think that in terms of our messaging and communications around this, we really, coming from the city, people don't do a really good job of really broadcasting things out loudly. And I will say in this instance, it is very much a pilot. It's small. We hope that after this first iteration of the pilot, we will be scaling this effort and being able to really grow this. And I think in that time span will be, I think a lot of more people will know about this program, but people haven't heard about it really because we're sort of in this laboratory mode of let's test this, let's tweak this, let's make sure this actually works for the drivers before we're actually growing and putting more into the program. I hope I helped answer that question.
No, that's great. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening, and I think it's really a call to action that if you're hearing about something that you're interested in, and I'm talking now to everybody who's viewing, part of your role is helping to spread the word and helping make sure that people do know about these programs, because word of mouth is a really powerful tool in anyone's communication efforts. All right, well, let's dig a little bit more into, I think, the overall electrical grid, I'm going to say. I'm really curious. I know that here in Washington State, a lot of our power is generated through hydro and through other green means. Kenworth, you are a local company, correct?
Yep.
So,
Yes, we are.
PACCAR also?
Yes.
Very, very local. So we're all very much centered to this area where we do have a lot of green electricity generation. I'm curious if other local trucking companies, but in other parts of the country, if this is an industry-wide, are we seeing this pick up, or is this a little more unique to the Pacific Northwest due to so much of our electric grid being green?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually really great if you go on to the Department of Energy's website. You can type in your zip code and it'll populate with all of the sources of where your energy is actually coming from. So it gives you kind of a sweet graph that you can dig into. And yeah, in Washington, we have, I think the majority of our energy comes from renewable resources. So that's great. And that's great when you plug in an electric truck, you really are getting green energy that's powering that. As you go across the country, you will see more use of natural gas, some coal, some more fossil fuels that are powering a lot of the country. And as people figure out how to transition away from that. I think that's kind of the great thing about the electric vehicles is they'll take any kind of energy. If if you convert that to something more sustainable, then they'll use that sustainable energy right away. So that's the nice thing. As far as where we're seeing kind of these trucks first deployed, it's really where we have strong grant and incentive programs right now to bring down that initial cost. People definitely are interested in where the energy comes from and using it best, but right now it's kind of where people have designed really robust grant and incentive programs.
Yeah, and I will say that Texas is another place that has some sustainable energy that they have with the wind and with the sun, but with that, it's not always windy and it's not always sunny. So how do we figure out how to do battery storage? How do we figure out how to make sure that that's sustainable, not just from a perspective of being clean, but also to make sure that these trucks are getting refueled as they need to with electricity?
I have a couple of quick cost questions for you. How much is your average standard ICE or internal combustion engine rig?
It's kind of all over the place depending on options, but yeah, you'll probably see it in the neighborhood of $120,000 to $150,000 for your typical Class 8 truck.
Actually, less than I thought it would be when I look at these trucks on the road. And then how much is the average EV from Kenworth?
It's about $450,000 list price before any of those grants and incentives. So it's quite a bit more expensive, yeah.
What is the charging comparison or the pricing comparison between charging an electric vehicle versus gas, especially now that we're seeing gas prices go up a lot? And my car is only a 10-gallon tank. So can we do the big rig comparison of electric versus ICE in fuel and battery charges?
Well, that's also kind of dependent on where you live.
In what time of day that you're fueling your EV.
Yeah, we kind of use as a benchmark roughly half, but it really depends on where when you're charging, where you're charging, and diesel or gasoline prices, they fluctuate throughout the year, or whatever else is happening around the world. So energy prices can do some of that, but they're a little more stable. And state by state, utility by utility, you'll get a different rate.
Yeah, and in the grand scheme of things, we are still seeing it. Electricity is less than gas and diesel, so you are getting that savings there.
So is Kenworth reducing the amount of trucks that you're making and manufacturing that are running on diesel now?
Well, we're actually moving into a lot of regulations that basically require us a certain percentage for all the diesels that we were to sell have to be zero emission. So just by nature of that, we'll basically start balancing out, as our increase of zero emission vehicles and sales increases, then some of that diesel will also decrease.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the role of regulation that I mentioned earlier is really driving down the production of diesel vehicles over the next few years. Really, California is leading that with mandating a certain percentage of zero-emission vehicles, battery electric specifically, as a driving percentage, starting with like 5% or between 5 and 9% of vehicles. Commercial vehicle has to be zero-emission, battery electric, and some states will follow in the coming years, likely, but right now, California is leading that mandate, and so the industry is trying to respond, and we will be responding accordingly. And so, again, there's a role of just the market itself and all the factors that we're hearing about, cost, incentives. A lot of right now is so early that those incentives really drive adoption, as Sean and Jennifer have mentioned.
Excellent. Sean, you were talking in your presentation about the hydrogen fuel cell. And in so many ways, it seemed like the hydrogen fuel cell was just a superior to the EV battery in a lot of ways, besides cost. Right now. So given it's so much faster to recharge and range, why should we be focusing on that technology?
Well, since we're at the Science Center, right now, the fuel cell truck, it's kind of a science project. It's very early days. And so when you look at it in comparison to battery electric, I actually don't think that it's one technology versus the other. I think they're pretty complementary. If you have a short route, that works for that weight sensitivity with battery electric, and it's actually very simple. Batteries to an electric motor, that's been around for a while, and you don't have to do as much maintenance. It'll be cheaper. So that's where it still makes sense for battery electric. Once you start going longer distances or more weight-sensitive operations, that's where the hydrogen fuel cell becomes a better use of technology. But again, very expensive, and right now, the infrastructure is pretty limited. There's about, I want to say, a half dozen heavy-duty hydrogen refueling stations in the nation. Most of them are all in Southern California. So that's where it's really almost a chicken and the egg kind of thing. What comes first, the truck or the infrastructure? So as we progress that technology, I'm sure we'll talk more with fuel providers and work with them to kind of have a coordinated approach to phasing that in.
How different is the hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure for charging? How much does that differ from the standard more of EV battery charging that is a lot more widespread already?
Well, I think it's more actually similar to kind of our natural gas fueling, or even like a diesel fueling. It's a gas that can be trailered to a location, and then you fill it with a hose and a nozzle out of a pump, basically. So it's actually pretty similar. It's just kind of, where would you build those for heavy-duty applications, and how do you actually produce the hydrogen itself? Is that using green resources? Let's make sure that we're still fueling it with the clean energy to create the hydrogen itself as well.
Yeah, I think Sean had mentioned a little earlier that just compressed hydrogen requires specialized tanks. These are tanks that are carbon fiber reinforced, 10,000 psi, which is a lot of pressure to make sure that it's safe, and it's so that is infrastructure, that is cost to building into any, it's not necessarily going to be your local truck stop, gas station initially to have those tanks and that infrastructure. So I think it's still going to be somewhat specialized. But there are incentives or government funding that I mentioned earlier to build that infrastructure, and how quickly that comes will all depends, I think, how that funding flows to partnerships.
Awesome. Tracey, got a question for you. Can you dive a little bit more into the health concerns within the South Park and Georgetown community due to the exposure of pollution?
Yes. Well, some of the statistics that I've read is that the life expectancy in some cases has a direct correlation to the exposure to particulate matter in the air. The discrepancy in life expectancy is, in some cases, 13 years less in the Duwamish Valley as compared to a more affluent neighborhood like Laurelhurst in Seattle. So that's one, and that the childhood asthma rate in those particular neighborhoods is exacerbated. So those are some of the challenges and issues that have been raised over many years from the different community members there.
Those are sobering statistics, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's the manufacturing of these fuels, as well as what is coming out of the tailpipe. And so I like that through this conversation, we're sort of touching on all aspects of that, because it all factors in and it all goes into our environment. This is a question for all of you. Given how big this initiative is of getting to big rig zero emission, if each of you had a magic wand and could make one thing happen overnight, what would you each pick from? Andy, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, I mean, to me, that really is having the infrastructure that is coming from sustainable sources to power. Without the infrastructure, we can't build. People won't buy the vehicles because if there's no way to charge them. So I think if it was a magic wand, it would be the infrastructure, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think I would choose the same thing. If we could wave a magic wand and upgrade our grid to be very efficient and run on renewable energy, I think that would be, that's the most monumental task right now, and some of the things that is really holding up some of that progress as we've designed the vehicles. We just need to get them out there and be able to work with all the chargers and the electric grid to support it.
And I will echo that. However, I will say, I'll go a little rogue here, and I will say that I think education is a really big thing. So I wish that there was education out there for everyone readily available for them to understand the impact of this and how much it takes, and then knowing everything about the truck, everything about the government grants and incentives, and everything about the charging. So it's not just one piece of it, but the education piece of it all is what I've seen has been a little bit lacking. And so how can we get everybody on board with being educated about it?
Tracy?
Yes, and I would have to agree as well. I would say education is absolutely key and crucial in ensuring that people understand why the policy is changing, how to get into these trucks, where the resources are. That's pretty much most of my job these days, is really mapping all of that out for the drivers.
Excellent. A lot of the examples that you all were citing were Texas, California, places that I think of as classically fairly warm, which leads to our next question about weather. Extreme weather changes seems to be a big issue with smaller EV vehicles. So what happens when it gets really cold and it snows here in Seattle? What's happening to the range, to the charging time, to everything about these vehicles?
Yeah, that's a good concern. So at our test facility up in Mount Vernon, I'll plug that again. Go check that out sometime. They have a climactic chamber in there that can simulate all sorts of different altitudes and temperatures. It's really a cool place to visit. And so we've run our trucks through there, the electric ones, the diesel ones. The electric ones, you can see, a drop in as much as 20% of your range if it goes below freezing. We advise people to use preconditioning features on the chargers, so you can basically charge it right before you start operation, and that'll use the charger's energy to warm up your batteries. Otherwise, if you were to let the batteries cold soak, even if they were fully charged, you're going to be using more of your energy to power your battery chiller, and that regulates the temperature of the batteries. So that's just kind of a method of practice and operation that we're trying to educate people on to use it. But it is definitely, batteries like to be in temperatures that people like to be in. That's the easiest way to put it.
And fun little fact, but one of the first chargers we ever deployed was in Alaska. So they are still working. Everything's going great. So these chargers are made to be outside, made to be inside. So no concerns about weather from that aspect.
I feel like I have to ask more questions about the test facility.
Yes.
What is the temperature range that you can create in this artificial environment?
That's a great question. I know they basically tried to simulate Death Valley in the summer and then Yellowknife, Canada in the winter. So it's about as extreme as the environments you'll see on Earth.
So we're there. I mean, I've been in it, so they regularly do testing at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as 100, up to probably, I've seen 120 degrees. So I think the range is a little bit broader than that, what they're capable of. But yeah, we, in the commercial vehicle industry, we design our vehicles to be minus 40 to operate there, and also, over 110 degrees. So that's kind of, these big rig trucks are designed for.
What else can you test in that system? Temperature changes, and did you say altitude?
Altitude, yeah, altitude.
How
yeah.
does altitude factor into the drivability and the life cycle and the lifespan of a battery?
Wow, that's a great question too. The altitude change I would say is probably more relevant for internal combustion trucks that are using more air. Now, if we start talking about fuel cells and that, then there's more air that's necessary to work with that. So you might see some of that tested in their battery. Not as much difference with the altitude, actually.
Well, it's still fun to know that you could create these
Yeah.
different environments. Okay, so for everybody watching who's astronomy minded, we can't yet pretend that we're trucking on other planets, but the full range of where we have roads and trucking routes in our country and actually our hemisphere are very much included.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What's something you're curious about? This is a question for everybody again, and I ask it because we at Pacific Science Center love curiosity. Curiosity not just in our professional lives, but also interest of us as STEM professionals outside of our workday. So what's something that you, as your STEM professional, or as you as a person, are curious about?
Yeah, I think I'll go first. I attend a lot of expos and kind of stand with the charger, but one of the questions I ask people is, what's your view of the charger? What do you think about it? And I love hearing people's perspective. It's a great opportunity to see different walks of life and what people think and maybe how they've been educated or how we can have a conversation about it. So always my curiosity and how I ask someone is what do you think about this and what are your views on it?
Excellent.
Well, you know what? On the way walking in here, I noticed that you took away that bike with the counterweight out front, and I was always curious about that, how that thing worked. And as I came to field trips here as a kid, I always wanted to ride that. So I'm still very curious about riding that bike and why you took it away.
We'll talk later.
Okay.
Tracy?
Oh gosh, curious about so many things, but mostly curious to see how our society will shift. We are talking about transitioning to electric vehicles, but that requires a behavioral shift in many ways because you're talking about how you're going to charge, and currently we have a lot of gas stations, and that shift will have to happen as well. And so I'm curious about how this will all unfold at a larger scale.
Thank you. And Andy?
Well, my curiosity comes in many forms. And, I always wonder how our next generation is going to look at transportation in general. And because every generation now looks at life differently because of, for example, social media. But transportation, I know a lot more young people who do not drive, for example, or do not care to really have a driver's license. But in the area that we work in, commercial vehicles, we do need a lot more people to drive. But then partly also we're working on autonomous technology. So to lessen the need for physical drivers. So my curiosity comes in all of how that plays into the perspective of our society and how our next generation is going to look at transportation and how it all fits together in their lives. And I think echoing some of our panelists here.
Well, thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. I hope that everybody watching remains curious. We're actually curious about how you enjoyed tonight's program, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So we're going to put a link to a very short survey into the YouTube chat. We'd love to hear your feedback from you on this program. Jennifer and Tracy, Sean, Andy, thank you so much for joining tonight. Andy?
Yeah, I just want to again thank you, Pacific Science Center, just for your presence here in the Seattle area, just being a focal point of great learning. And for young people as well as our adults and families, I've had many opportunities with my daughter to be here. And I think some of us have childhood memories of being here. And as part of Kenworth Truck Company and a division of PACCAR, we're very proud to be have collaborated over the years with Pacific Science Center. And as we celebrate 100 years of Kenworth and 50 years of PACCAR parts, we're so thankful for the community and City of Seattle, of course, just the foundation of Seattle and the area. Tracey, thank you so much for just giving us perspective, I think, on need for equity. So I really appreciate that, and thank you for just this time.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we have a lot of more upcoming programs and special events here at Pacific Science Center, and we hope that you will continue to be curious and join us. Most immediately coming up on May 18th, we have a science and a movie. It'll be the documentary Everest with special guests from the Fred Hutch talking about what happens with our bodies in those extreme elevation climbing environments. For our 21 plus audiences, we have a happy hour on May 17th and a Brewology event focusing on the science of beers, and beers for you to drink as well. And that'll be June 10th, that's Brewology. And every day we have IMAX movie, laser shows, and so much more. You can find out more about all of the events at our events link that we are posting right there in the chat. I want to remember that this talk and many more online resources and programs can all be found on Pacific Science Center's YouTube channel, our Curiosity at Home webpage, and on our general PACCAR.org webpage. Before I go, I'd like to extend one final thank you to all of our panelists for joining us tonight. Thank you very much, Tracey, Sean, Jennifer, and Andy. And I want to thank all of you for being here, joining us tonight, asking your questions, and being curious with us. Thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a great evening.